But I started by saying I'm delighted to have the opportunity to join you all on this very important occasion on the international calendar, International Women's Day. Although in the special circumstances this year, we're unable to be physically together, yet we gather all the more in a spirit of solidarity and sisterhood as we acknowledge and celebrate the remarkable and essential work undertaken day in, day out by so many women within our society. This year has brought into sharp focus the vital contribution of women as we struggled with COVID-19, particularly the contribution made by so many low-paid workers in our society, as you've just talked about, Rita. As a nation facing together the challenge of the coronavirus pandemic, we are indebted to the remarkable courage and generosity of those who provide essential services in our hospitals, in our shops, and out in the wider communities. So many of those workers are women. And as we sadly know, so much of that work has traditionally been underappreciated, underrated, and underpaid by a society that continues to define valuable works in ways that fail to encompass many of the vital services on which citizens depend. May it all be different when COVID-19 is over. The front line is a wide front. Those who care for the elderly, work in the hospitals, look after children, and who respond in so many selfless ways to the needs of their fellow citizens. Just as you've said, Rita, they have undeniably kept our society going throughout this most demanding and difficult time. They have worked and continue to work with tireless generosity, putting their own health and indeed their own lives at risk as they do so. To all these women, in whatever ways and in whatever circumstances, who have responded to the coronavirus crisis with such a selfless spirit of solidarity, we owe an enormous debt of gratitude. Let us not forget, however, that leaves us with a responsibility. Gratitude can never be a substitute for adequate pay, security of employment, trade union representation, and fair working conditions, and the dignity that is the right of all workers in any fair and inclusive society. Throughout this past year, we've rediscovered the importance of care and solidarity. And it's my hope that when we emerge from the coronavirus pandemic, it is care and solidarity that will guide and shape the new society that we craft together in the post-pandemic world. So congratulations to all, particularly women, for how they rose to the challenge of the COVID-19, what it brought into being. Most of us had never heard the word pandemic, and we were shocked and frightened to our core exactly almost a year ago, the 11th of March. And then we gradually began to realize what a dreadful disease it is and how it changed fundamentally our day-to-day living. We are still feeling the stress and anxiety, and we will for some time to come. Of course, for some, sadly, the suffering they endured through contracting the virus will continue. And for others, the loss of their loved ones, without the consolation of being able to be with them, will have a lasting sad effect. Other casualties are those who, from distress, suffer depression and mental health problems, and so many who lost their jobs, who couldn't cope with the demands of home, work, homeschooling, all of the things that was put upon women, that disproportionate burden.
I can hear it.
Can you hear me?
Make sure I'm muted.
Sorry, Sabina, if you just unmute again, and I'm just muting everyone else.
Like this to mute. Okay. Am I all right?
Yes, please carry on.
You're all right.
All right. Well, through all of that, the wonderful thing was how heroically and gloriously people rose to the challenge, and with what courage. What a change of consciousness it brought about as people came to a new realization of how vulnerable and fragile our very existence as individuals and humanity is. We are so lucky to live in a democracy where we could turn to the state, the government, for a plan for the organs of state, over 50, I don't know how many, over 50,000 health and public service workers took over and stood in the front line of action and danger. The public, the state that has been so decried and bad-mouthed for so many, who did we turn to? Who was there? So that is a lesson for the future, the need for a strong state that people can rely on. But we also had the second line of volunteers, like so many of yourselves. Now, we were forced to face fundamental questions about how we look at society and what we value. What are the essential structures? What are the basic essential tasks? What is essential work? And who are the essential workers? It is clear how unprepared many of the structures of society are, and that a whole new lot of changes must take place, and that we create a society that has as its foundation the health and well-being of all. That is, as it says in the third Sustainable Development Goal, health and well-being. A society where basic public services and caring institutions must be given priority. Universal basic services must be provided in the structures of health, housing, education, infrastructure, transport, communication, and that there must be guarantees that work is decent, fulfilling, secure, and that it has adequate trade union representation and basic protection, and where human rights for women and men and all gender rights are legally respected, and where culture is promoted and valued, and especially a culture of non-violence, where gender and domestic violence are never tolerated. Today, for International Women's Day, we acknowledge that as women are the majority in the caring institutions and carry a disproportionate responsibility for care in the family situation, they bear the brunt of the suffering of this pandemic and will have the most lasting effects. When this pandemic is over, what will the world be like? What will the world of work be like? What changes that took place will be kept? And who will gain and who will lose? How much of the backlog of problems not dealt with and how much suffering that has happened will come to light and how much recovery will be needed? It is clear that we are not prepared for the eventuality of a crisis like the pandemic. But it's also clear that we can learn from it. How we were not prepared and what changes we need to put in place to have a well-functioning infrastructure that can deal in the best possible way with any eventuality. As we emerge from the pandemic, we know things must change, and it is acknowledged that as austerity has not worked, as Rita mentioned, the services, the infrastructure built up was over four decades now has been chipped away at. And all that has become clear in that it was a disaster. It has not worked. And I think it's very clear that it will not and cannot be imposed after the pandemic. If a country and society is to flourish, it needs to be happy. People need to have a good basic standard of living. That means that they have to have their basic universal needs met in order that they can survive and thrive, think for themselves, and participate in society. But to conclude, during the lockdown, we saw how people can adapt to change. And we also saw how it effect on different people could be very different depending on their circumstances. People with good sized housing, with space for privacy and social distancing and adequate green spaces could fare so much better than those in cramped, overcrowded housing. Because of the disastrous state of our housing situation, they were made very vulnerable. The effect of all that on people's mental health and on the incidence of domestic violence, which has sadly increased by 25% over the period, means that there are many problems needing remedy. As I said at the outside, the quality of the community we create and live in is what helps make the quality of our lives enjoyable and secure. Madge, Reese's wonderful mother, said, the real work always takes place in the community. But the environment for that community must be supported by properly resourced facilities. It needs to have a well-funded resource centre and development team that can cater for the needs and development of all ages and all generations. It needs not just a well-resourced library and librarian, but it needs meeting rooms for classes, for discussions, for pastimes, needs a sports hall for indoor games and martial arts, etc. And it needs to be empowered to take part in the decisions that affect its lives and its environment, like the City Development Plan, the Public Participation Network, etc. I have always been in such admiration of St. Michael's Resource Centre. I mean, it is such a headline, and it's the wonderful, wonderful work and brochures you've got out, and why they haven't been replicated all over Dublin and all over the country is an absolute disgrace. The answers were all there, but not listened to. Public-private partnerships, no, the things you fought for that did not get. Now, and we wish that we could have a Rita Fagan as inspiration and driving force in all communities.
Yeah, I'm up for that.
I also wish the government would listen to St. Michael's Resource Centre insistence that public land must be used for public amenity and for public housing. Today, as we gather to mark and honour the work of women around the globe, we do so with a renewed commitment to challenging the societal norms and values that have led to the economic marginalization of so many women and the devaluing of the vital and indispensable work they offer to our societies and our world. And let us also resolve on this International Women's Day 2021 to stand in solidarity with those women across the globe whose economic security will be disproportionately affected by the consequences of COVID-19. It is greatly worrying, and it must concern us all to know that not only will an estimated 96 million people be driven into poverty as a result of the pandemic, but that almost half of those will be women and girls. So I thank you for inviting me to speak to you today, and it has been an honor and a pleasure. And I want to wish you all here and all across the globe, women, a very happy International Women's Day and many good things in the future. So, Araya Lin Lehela.